Bruchim Abayim to the eighth in the continuing series of lectures, Shiurim, on the one of the Magnus Opum of the Netziv on the Chumash, Ha'amak Dava. We're going to begin today with a slightly different topic in the Netziv, and this is a topic which actually, as we'll see in Yetz Hashem, actually occupied some of the Rishonim. Certainly those Rishonim that in other words, the medieval commentators, specifically those who were interested in the lost art of Pshuta Shamikra, tried to understand. Most people define it as being the simple meaning of the verse, but I would say probably the intended meaning of the verse. That's how we understand Pshuta Shamikra, in accordance with the Netziv introduction, Kidmas HaEmek. Anyway, we're actually going to focus once again. We're going to be in Bereshis. In Bereshis, in Pashas Vayishlach. So we have the story of the rape of Dinah, as the Chumash says in Perek Lamed Dalet, Pasuk Aleph. Vateitze Dinah bas Leah, right? Dinah bas Leah went out. Asher Yolda LeYaakov, right? That Leah gave birth to Dinah from Yaakov. Lo'ois bivnois ha'oretz, right? And in Pasuk Beis, Vayar Oisa Shem ben Chamor, Shem ben Chamor saw her, right? Vayikach Oisa, Vayishkav Oisa, Vayamer. Okay, so Shem ben Chamor rapes Dinah, right? Now, before this, there's a, in other words, this is the beginning of a new Parsha, Parsha Stuma, and before this, there's a very small Parsha. In other words, that actually Psukim Yud Ches until Chav, and there it speaks about Vayova Yankov Shalom Il Shechem Asher Be'eretz Canaan V'Voyed Padan Aram Vayichanas B'nei Ha'ir. Yankov Avinu comes to Shechem. This is of course after the historical encounter with Esav, with his brother Esav, and he comes to Ir Shechem. And then it says Vayikan Eschelkas Asodot Shanoto Sham Olam Miyad B'nei Chamor Avi Shechem B'mei Aksita. So he acquires a property. Vayotzem Sham Mizbeach, and he builds there a Mizbeach. Vayikolo Kel Elokei Yisrael. And he calls the Mizbeach Kel Elokei Yisrael, because that's a very, very loose translation. In any case, those of you who are familiar with Rashi on the Chumash in Pasuk Chof, Rashi speaks about what is the meaning of the Pasuk, because it brings Chazal, the Kosh Baruch called Yaakov Kel, and says Rashi, Divrei Teira Kepaji Foitzasela, Mischalkim Mekamat Ta'amim. So Rashi speaks about the depth of Torah, the different layers of Torah. Vanili Yashib Pshuta Shamikra Basi. So Rashi says, I've come to be Miyashib Pshuta Mikra. Now, people seem to, in my opinion, to draw the erroneous conclusion that Rashi is interested in Pshuta Shamikra. No, Rashi is usually not interested in Pshuta Shamikra. Rashi is interested in the understanding the pasuk based upon Chazal. But here, when Rashi says, brings the Gemara Megillah, and says Divrei Torah Patish Shefoitzatzela, which means that the Torah can be understood on different levels, Rashi decides not to explain the pasuk, the verse based upon Chazal, but actually attempts at what's called a Pshuta Shamikra, the intended meaning of the pasuk. In any case, the Ha'amak Dava here says something very interesting, right? Once again, in Pasuk Chav, in the Diba HaMaschil Kel Elokei Yisrael, says the Ha'amak Dava, I'm going to read inside and translate word for word. B'midrash Isa, Kra, Kara Li'atzmai El. That he called himself El. So says the Netziv, Ve'ena Kavana Shekoli Atzmai El Chas V'Shalom. Chas V'Shalom, he wouldn't call, Yaakov Avinu would not call himself a god. Ela Perush Shekoli Atzmai Yisrael. Says the Netziv that the Medrash means to say that Yaakov Avinu called himself Yisrael. Therefore, Kodesh Baruch was called Kel Elokei Yisrael, right? The God of Yisrael. In other words, Yaakov Avinu is referring to himself as Yisrael. And says the Netziv that the person calls him as Be'ach, right? It means that he's praying. It's a tefillah. He's davening. Hainu she's part of the mizbeach, that he davened in front of the mizbeach, and in his davening he said, "Elokei Avraham, Elokei Yitzchak, Elokei Yisrael." It was Yaakov Avinu referred to himself by the name of Yisrael, and says the Netziv, based upon the Medrash, "V'nenesh b'fil zeh." And because of this, he was punished by Ma'aseh Dina, Kedisa Medes Rabbah. In other words, Chazal are basically inferring from the Smichas HaParshias, from the fact that the Parsha of the Mizbeach, that Yaakov Avinu called it Kel Elokei Yisrael, when the Tzivah says Yaakov Avinu refers to himself as Yisrael, the fact that this Parsha precedes and introduces the Parsha of the rape of Dinah. So from this, Chazal learned that in fact that there was an Oynish. What was the Oynish? The Oynish was not that Yaakov Avinu called himself God, Chas v'Shalom. Yaakov Avinu wouldn't do something like that, but he called himself Yisrael. Okay, now you're going to ask me a question. What are you talking about? Right before he meets Esav, he wrestles with the Malach, with the Sar of Esav, who calls him Yisrael. So says the Netziv, "V'hainu she'afal gav she'omer ha'malach sheyeh nikra Yisrael," even though the Malach said to Yaakov Avinu that he will be called Yisrael, right? And that pasuk, of course, is a famous pasuk, but I'll refer to you right now. It says in Perek Lamed Beis, pasuk Chav Ches, that he wrestles, right? He wrestles with someone. Wrestles with someone. Vayome elav ma shemecha, and the angel, the Malach, or this person he wrestles with, the Sar of Esav, according to Chazal, asks him, "What's your name?" Vayome Yaakov. My name is Yaakov. Vayome. This is now in Perek Lamed Beis, pasuk Chav Tes. Vayome lo Yaakov ye'amer oid shimcha. Your name will not be called anymore Yaakov. Ki im Yisrael. Your name will be called Yisrael. Ki sarisa im Elohim ve'anoshim v'tuchal. Because you wrestle with Elohim, right? With mighty ones. Ve'im anoshim, and with people, other people, v'tuchal, and you overcome them. Now, the fact is that the Malach says, "Lo ye'ama oid shimcha kim Yisrael." You will be called Yisrael, but the Malach is not telling him that your name is Yisrael, that you can call yourself Yisrael. Right? Why is this true? This is true because later on, right? Later on, the Torah tells us, this is in Perek Lamed Hey pasuk Tes. Vayera Elokim el Yaakov yoid. HaKadosh Baruch Hu appears to Yaakov again. B'voy be Padan Aram, when he's coming from Padan Aram. Vayivorech Ha'isai, and he blesses him, gives him a bracha. Vayom lo Elokim Shimcha Yaakov. So HaKadosh Baruch Hu says to him, God says to him, your name, because your name now is Yaakov. Lo Yikare Shimcha Yaakov Kim Yisrael Yeshimecha. Right? Your name will be Yisrael. Vayikra Shema Yisrael. So in other words, what the Netziv is pointing out is that really Yaakov Avinu, right? This is of course in terms of our Musakim, of course. We can't speak about a Chas v'Shalom Chet of the others. But Yaakov Avinu referred to himself Yisrael when the Malach speaks to him. But in fact, actually, he was only really allowed to use that name when HaKadosh Baruch Hu tells him or commands him that his name will be Yisrael, and that's later on. So because of that, Chazal learned that there was an oynish, there was a quote-unquote a punishment, and Dinah was raped. That's what the Netziv says. Okay, now what's interesting is, right, is that one could raise a question. What's the question? Because now, in other words, after Yaakov wrestles with the angel, right? So it says, once again, this is in Perek Lamed Beis, Pasuk Lamed Beis. Vayizach lo Hashem es kasher ovas Penuel, when he crossed Penuel, the sun came out. V'utzaleya al yerecha, and he's limping. Al Kain, Pasuk Lamed Gimel, therefore, Lo Yoichlu B'nei Yisrael es Gid Anosha. Right? B'nei Yisrael will not eat Gid Anosha. Right? Ad HaYom Hazeh, until this day. Now, says the Netziv, I'm going back to the Amud Dova in Pasuk Chof of Perek Lamed Gimel, right? And says, Ukedi'is v'perek Gid Anosha, the Chachamim svira lei the Gid Anosha b'Sinai nema b'Nechsiv al Kain lo yochlu b'nei Yisrael v'adayin lo nika shmo Yisrael. The Netziv brings a bit of a raya here like this. What's part of the Netziv? The part of the Netziv is, if in fact Yaakov Avinu, well, you can learn the Netziv in one or two ways, but I'm going to learn it the way I want to learn it. The Netziv points out that we see that the Torah refers to him as Yisrael. Al Kain lo yochlu b'nei Yisrael, the Gid Anosha. The Torah is referring to Yaakov Avinu as Yisrael. According to Chazal, he wasn't called Yisrael until later on. Now, Netziv refers us to a Gemara in Chulin, in the Amud Dova. And there, actually, the Manamokim is Kuf Aleph and Beis, but actually there's a Mishnah in Kuf and Beis in Chulin, in Perek Gid Anosha. So there's a Machlokes Chachamim and Rabbi Yehuda. Chachamim say, in the Mishnah, we're speaking about the Gid Anosha, Noyeg b'Tahira, Gid Anosha, the Issa Gid Anosha is only the Gid Anosha of a behemoth Torah, a kosher animal, Ve'enu Noyeg b'Tameya. It's not Noyeg b'Tameya. Right? And so the Issa Gid Anosha is Noyeg in a kosher animal, but not a non-kosher animal. Rabbi Yehuda Oimer, Af b'Tameya. Rabbi Yehuda says the Issa of Gid Anosha applies to an animal which is not kosher either. Omer Rabbi Yehuda, so Rabbi Yehuda says, for halom ibnei Yaakov nesa Gid Anosha. Gid Anosha was forbidden from the time of Yaakov Avinu. V'adayin behemoth tameya muteres lahen. At the time of Yaakov Avinu, it was mutter, or mi'ikar din, to eat a behemoth tameya, to eat a non-kosher animal. Even though Chazal say in Yuma, the others kept the entire Torah, from Avinu kept the entire Torah. Nonetheless, they were required to keep the entire Torah. Actually, this mice I think with Yaakov Avinu takes place probably outside of Eretz Yisrael. So according to the Ramban, even in other words, they didn't keep the Torah outside of Eretz Yisrael. In any case, Rabbi Yehuda says, what?
Was it in Yisrael?
No, he's wrestling. When he's wrestling, I think when he's wrestling with the Malach is before he comes to Eretz Yisrael. Because then after they come to Eretz Yisrael, because it takes them to take away the Avodah Zarah. Very meduk, like the Ramban. Maybe the Ramban even refers to himself before. Amulai b'Sinai nema ela shenichta b'mkaimai. So Chazal say that the command was given at Sinai. The command was given at Sinai, but nonetheless it was, and the Chumash was written here because the Torah associate the Gid Anosha with the struggle of Yaakov Avinu with the Malach. Now, I'm just reading from the Gemara in Kufal Amud Beis. Tanya, the Gemara brings a brisa where it expands on Rabbi Yehuda's argument. Actually, expands on the refutation of Rabbi Yehuda. Amud Rabbi Yehuda says the brisa. I'm one down Kufal Amud Beis. This is actually the Maramokim that the Netziv himself brings. Amud Rabbi Yehuda. Chacham said to Rabbi Yehuda, "V'chinema al kein lo yochlu b'nei Yisrael." It says, "Al kein lo yochlu b'nei Yisrael, v'lo loy nema ela b'nei Yisrael, v'loy nikru b'nei Yisrael at Sinai." It says Al Kain, right? It says Al Kain lo yochlu b'nei Yisrael, and Klal Yisrael not called b'nei Yisrael until Sinai. Ela b'Sinai nema, but rather in fact it was the command. Right? It was said at Sinai. It was this. Literally speaking, it means the pasuk was said at Sinai, right? Okay. Ella, right? Shenichta b'mkaimai. Later me'ezet tam nesalahem to give us, to inform us of the reason. Now, what I understand that the Netziv is saying is that, and he says, The Chacham Svilu to get Anasha B'Sinai Nema. The Ksiv Al Keno Yochel B'nei Yisrael. And the Ksiv expands in Amak Dover and says that in Hachinami, according to Rav Yehuda, there wasn't a chet. Meaning what? Meaning the following thing. In other words, that's what the Ksiv says. In other words, he says in the Hachav Dover, right, on this Dibar Maskil and Pasuk Chov, about Rabbi Yehuda, right? Severe them koimei nema. In other words, it was said here, in Ken Kavan Niko Yaakov b'dvar hamalach Yisrael. Yaakov was called Yisrael. In Ken Yabaza Oynish Shekatz by Yisrael. It was Oynish because it was called Yisrael. Now, let's reflect upon this. The Netziv is telling us an incredible chidush in the Machalis Chacham Rabbi Yehuda. Because if you would ask the person and say, even given Chachamim, in other words, even given Chachamim, right? In other words, or in giving Rabbi Yehuda, in other words, it says, Al Kelo Yochel B'nei Yisrael Sagir Anasha. So, what's the Machlokas Rabbi Yehuda and Chachamim? So, the Netziv is learning, very interesting enough, is, you could say, according to Rabbi Yehuda, could also mean B'nai Yisrael. In other words, B'nai Yisrael also means that the Torah is telling us, for this reason, B'nai Yisrael, right, cannot need to get Anasha. In other words, what's it do with Machlos Rabbi Yehuda Chachamim? In other words, Yehuda Chachamim is speaking about when it was forbidden. But the fact is that, in other words, Rabbi Yehuda, in principle, can agree that Yaakov Avinu was not called Yisrael. But the point of the Netziv, Rabbi Yehuda is arguing on the Medrash, being like this. The Netziv is saying is that the narrative of the wrestle of Yaakov Avinu, right, and everything about the narrative was said, kiviyachol, at that time. It was said at that time. The pasuk, Al Kelo Yochel B'nei Yisrael Sagir Anasha, was revealed, quote unquote, inserted at a later time, at the time of Matan Torah. In other words, you could say that there was a Torah of Torah's Bereshis, like Rashi explains the Chumash Yena Mishpatim. Moshe Rabbeinu had written Chumash Bereshis, and this pasuk, Perek Lamed Beis, pasuk Lamed Gimel, was not yet in Chumash Bereshis. And then, at a later point in time, right, after Har Sinai, of course, there's a machlokes, Samachum Aleph and Gittin, with the Torah Parsha Nitna, Chasuma Nitna. Right? At a later point, there was a Sivoy, there was a command of Gid Anasha, and that Sivoy commandment was revealed to Moshe Rabbeinu. Moshe Rabbeinu wrote it in the Torah, Al Pi HaGvura, in Chumash Bereshis. So the Netziv understands that the Torah was revealed at different times, and Rabbi Yehuda's chaylik. Rabbi Yehuda says that when Moshe Rabbeinu wrote Bereshis originally, before Sinai, this pasuk was there. Meaning that what? That Yaakov Avinu was called Yisrael before Sinai. And therefore, according to Rabbi Yehuda, since this is a tzivoy, a commandment of the HaKadosh Baruch Hu, we can't say that there would be a punishment if Yaakov Avinu, right, calls himself Yisrael. And therefore says that it's this medrash, which attributes the rape of Dinah to Yaakov Avinu called Yisrael, is not going according to Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda would argue on this. That's what the Netziv is saying. In other words, we see interesting a chiddush that the Netziv is not speaking about the concept of command only, but he's also speaking about the times of the writing of the Chumash, right, from before Matan Torah. We know that Moshe Rabbeinu writes the Chumash before he goes up to Sinai, at the end of Mishpatim. It's only according to one opinion of Chazal. And afterwards, we discussed this in the oral nature of the written law. So in other words, the Netziv understands that in fact, actually, we have here different levels. And Moshe Rabbeinu Al Pi HaGvura is writing and, in fact, redacting the Chumash all Al Pi HaGvura. That's what we see here in the Netziv. A very interesting understanding of the text of the Chumash. Now,
why is that not clear from the Gemara itself?
No, because the Gemara you could say that, in other words, the Gemara you could say, and the Gemara, there's actually a very interesting parasha of Mishnayos of the Rambam. In other words, the Gemara you can say is that, in other words, that Chacham understand that all the tzivuyim were revealed after Sinai. And Rabbi Yehuda, what we could say is that, but since the Chumash happened to, no, Rabbi Yehuda could say also after Sinai, the Torah was written with the Tzivuy, but since the Tzivuy was written in the context of Yaakov Avinu, so you could say it refers to Behemoth Tameya. In other words, Rabbi Yehuda Chacham do not necessarily have to be speaking about the historical truth. They can be speaking about, in other words, they can be speaking about why did the Chumash decide to put this commandment not in post-Matan Torah in the Chumash, but here in Bereshis.
But it was written at that time.
Right, both can agree. In other words, the Netziv here is taking church, in my opinion, is understanding it in a very, very deeper, not necessarily deeper, but in a much more of a textual context, historicist context. Now, what bothers the Netziv is in Perek Lamed Daled, Pasuk Zayin. Because what happens is that after the rape of Dinah, so the news gets back to Yaakov Avinu. That's we start actually from Pasuk K, Perek Lamed Daled Pasuk K. Yaakov Shama Kitimi as Dinah Bitoy. Yaakov Avinu hears that Dinah was raped. His daughter, Uvanayu es B'knei Basade. And Yaakov's sons were tending the flock in the field. Ve'echus Yaakov ad Baya. Yaakov Avinu was quiet until they come. And then Shechem comes to Yaakov. Uvo Yaakov, Uvenei Yaakov, now I'm on Pasuk Zayin, Uvenei Yaakov bo min Asada, Kishama, somehow they hear that Dinah was raped, and they come to Yaakov Avinu. They become very angry. Ki nevala also v'Yisrael. A nevala, a terrible thing has been done. Be Yisrael. What does be Yisrael mean? Very interesting. L'shkavas bas Yaakov v'chein lo yasa. Something like that cannot be done. Should not be done. Now, the Netziv raises a question in the Hashkafa Dava. The Hashkafa Dava, he says, we see that the Chumash referred to Yaakov Avinu as Yisrael. Ki nevala also v'Yisrael. So it says in Netziv, in the Hashkafa Dava, once again, the Hashkafa Dava is on Pasuk Chav of Perek Lamed Gimel. Diba Amaskal Keloke Yisrael Sif Cotton Aleph for the Hashkafa Dava. So it says in Netziv, don't ask me a kasha for the pasuk later on. Kinavala also be Israel. Hare da Torah call Isa Yisrael gam l'fnei devar Hashem. There was the Torah called Yaakov Avinu Yisrael. L'fnei devar Hashem means before Matan Torah, before Har Sinai. Avala in the Vadei Uma b'chlal zera Yaakov kvar ha'isa mechuna b'shem Yisrael kamo Uma Yisraelis. Says in Netziv that the Zera Yaakov, maybe speaking about the Shiftei Kah, were already called Yisrael. Kamo Uma Yisraelis, like we refer to the Jewish nation. Uperez Hashem shekim l'mayla min hateva, and Yisrael means l'mayla min hateva, etc., etc. Okay? Right? In other words, Al Kain Shap because of Loshen Nevola also be Yisrael. Right? So what does the Torah mean? Nevola also be Yisrael. Perush. Be'uma Yisraelis lishkav as bas Yankov avi ha'uma. Okay? The daughter of Yaakov, who's the father of the nation, Yaakov levada oilin zbaradu nikar Yisrael. Okay, the Netziv. What about Gid Anosh? It says Bnei Yisrael. It was Yisrael refers to the Jewish people, so Bnei Yisrael also refers to the Jewish people. What's the entire deal of Chachamim? Mishum hachi b'mikra de Gid Anosha, t'ksiv Bnei Yisrael mashmo Bnei Ha'ish shenikra Shema Yisrael. The son of the Ish, of the man, is called Yisrael. In other words, the Netziv understood that we're learning Bnei Yisrael means the sons of Yisrael. Okay, so it's clear that, right? In other words, it must have been written afterwards because we're speaking about the sons of Yaakov, or the progeny of Yaakov himself. But Yisrael here means the nation, right? Very difficult in Netziv. You can think about it. I don't want to be mafalfel and ask kashas and give teilutz, and Netziv is very difficult. I'm a little bit curious why the Netziv learned like this. Why? Because let's look at the pasuk in Perek Lamadalet Pasuk Zayin. Uvnei Yankov bo min asada kishama. They came from the field kishama. V'yisatzu anoshim v'yechala ha'ma'od. They became, they were infuriated. Ki nevala also v'Yisrael. Lishkav es beis Yankov. V'chein lo yeyaseh. What does it mean, v'chein lo yeyaseh? This should not be done. Lo yeyaseh, I think, is a pluperfect form. Mm-hmm. It's not a... In other words, the Chumash, the narrative in Bereshis, usually speaks in the past tense. Yeyaseh indicates a future tense. Will not be done. Shall not be done. Now, the Netziv, of course, is very sensitive to the usage of Ye'asa, Ye'pa'el. Okay, now, why is that true? If you look, for example, in Vayera, Perek Chav Beis, Pasuk Yudalet, in the Akedah, it says, Vayikra Avram Shem Amokim Hahu Hashem Yireh. Okay, so far so good. Avram Avinu calls the place Hashem Yireh. God will see. Asher Ye'ameh Hayoim, which will be said today, Bahar Hashem Yireh. God will be seen. What does it mean, God will be seen? We're speaking about an event. In other words, it's a pluperfect. It's a verb in the future. Says the Netziv. Right now, of course, it says Asher Ye'ama Hayoim. Says the Netziv in Pasuk Yudalet, La'acha Matan Torah. When it's Tal Yisrael, nice Beis HaMikdash Sham. Says that it's Ye'ameh. Well, actually it says Ye'ameh Hayoim. Right? So, the Lashon of Ye'ra'eh says that Netziv is obviously speaking about after Matan Torah. Because it's only during the time of the writing of the Torah can you say God will be seen. Ye'ra'eh. Especially you can't say Hayom. I'm not sure if the deal is from Hayom Ye'ra'eh. I would say the two things go together. In other words, Bahar Hashem Yireh, God will be seen, which speaks about the Hakbolas B'nei Hashchina during the time of the Rega. Like the Gemara says, Chagiga Yireh, it refers to that. In other words, the Pasuk is certainly has to be speaking about, according to the Tzibur, the commandment, right? To in fact actually go to the Beis HaMikdash, right? And the Hashem Yireh, so therefore it has to be after Matan Torah. That's if you have to Matan Torah, because not only does it say Asher Ye'ameh Hayoim, but the Lashon Ye'am will be said today. God will be seen is certainly a present form of the verb, and you can't say it's part of the narrative in the past. But it has to be said at the time when the Torah was revealed and written by Moshe Rabbeinu al Pi HaGvura. That's Ye'ra'eh. Now, this raises an interesting question. Ani HaKatan would raise the following question. Why could I not say in Perek Lamed Pasuk Zayin, once again, the Pasuk was speaking about V'nei Yaakov bo min asada kishama v'yisatzu v'anosh v'yechal ha'ma'od ki nevala also v'Yisrael l'shkav es beis Yaakov v'chein lo ye'aseh. Why can I say the verb form of ye'aseh is a verb form that can only be after Matan Torah? And therefore it uses a lot. Therefore it's because the Vala Asa Yisrael. In other words, the Vala Asa Yisrael is speaking about after Matan Torah. In other words, there was quote unquote an insertion. Moshe Rabbeinu, when he wrote the Torah, said the Vala Asa Yisrael v'chein lo ye'asa. That's the way I would read the pasuk. I'm surprised Rabbeinu and Netziv Hashkafa that was the obviously easiest way to explain it. Mm-hmm. Now, this verb form, Hashem Yireh, has a very, very long history. It's a very, very long history. The time of the Rishonim, the Eben Ezra, there's a famous Eben Ezra, recently it's become made very, very famous, unfortunately. And I'd actually like to discuss this, but I'm going to discuss it in Mitzvah Shem in the next lecture, the next year. But what I want to say that as a temporary yishuv of the Netziv, I would say that Bishlam Hashem Yerayeh, we see this a mitzvah of the Torah of Chazal of Riyas, right? Riyas Pnei Hazorah during the time of the Regel. But Nevala also B'Yisrael v'chen lo ya'aseh, we can't associate any mitzvah or Isra of Chazal in this pasuk. Otherwise, the Netziv, even though he's trying to learn Pshut Shamikra, he's trying to learn it according to the strictures and the guidelines of Chazal. So that's where there's a machlokes in the Spir Chacham Rabbi Yehuda, and the Netziv will say that in fact, actually, this based upon Chazal, we see clearly that this pasuk was written at the time of Moshe Rabbeinu, at a later time. But Nevala also B'Yisrael v'chein lo ya'aseh, right? Where's the Isra of Chazal? Where do we see this like Leisasa, a mitzvah? I mean, speaking certainly about Goyim. So this is a very interesting question. Of course, I mean the Rishonim understand that that the Chiyuv Misa is because of Sheva B'nei Noach. Sheva B'nei Noach is in other words, it's not going. In other words, many Rishonim learn these are asmachtas. Certainly in Daf Lamed Chesed, in Bava Kama, the Netziv himself learns the Gemara that they were taken away during the time of Matan Torah.
Aleph or Bet?
Lamed Chesed, I think it's Lamed Chesed with Beis. I believe so. Okay, I mean, maybe I don't know.
I can check.
Okay, in any case. But in any case, we will, this in fact actually, Hashem Yerayeh is in fact actually discussed in the Rishonim, this Lashon. Most notably, it's actually discussed by the greatest of biblical commentaries, and the Netziv says that the Sefer was on his table when he learned the Chumash, and that's the Ibn Ezra. And the Ibn Ezra, on this pasuk, when it says Bahar Hashem Yerayeh, and not Hayoim, Bahar Hashem Yerayeh, so says the Ibn Ezra, let me get there, this is a Nikoris Gedolos. 1 second. Ibn Ezra, where are you? Bahar Hashem Yerayeh, not on Hayoim, Bahar Hashem Yerayeh, Ve'ela Hadvarim. Now what's Ela Hadvarim? So in Ela Hadvarim refers to what the Ibn Ezra is referring to you, what he says in Perak Aleph Pasuk Beis, Ela Hadvarim, and there's a very, very famous Ibn Ezra. Most people are not familiar with it, but Ibn Ezra speaks about V'im tavin soid hashnei masar. The soid hashnei masar. V'yichtav Moshe v'kanani az ba'ores b'Hashem Yerayeh. And this Ibn Ezra has been much ink has been spilt in this Ibn Ezra. The Ibn Ezra has a slightly, I think, probably different approach than the Netziv. But we're going to speak about that in Mitzvah Shem in the next shiur. Be'ezus Hashem Yisborach. Anyway, until then, from an undisclosed location in Yerushalayim Kodesh, be well.